Mr. Schlanger, it's a great pleasure to have you on this channel for this interview. You've been the spokesman of Lyndon LaRouche for years and a member of the Executive Intelligence Review since the 80s. Maybe we can start here with few words for Lyndon LaRouche that passed away in last February, and then you can introduce yourself for the audience.
Well, I consider Lyndon LaRouche to be the quintessential American statesman in the best tradition of the founding fathers of our country. I met Lynn when I was involved in the anti-war movement around in Vietnam in the early 70s. And what he kept saying to students is, okay, it's being against the war is fine. The question is, why are we in the war? What's the issue? And what's the solution? And he has always integrated a picture of international economics with strategic policy, with history. And in particular, he's known for his argument that much of the destruction of the modern world comes from the United Kingdom. In particular, not the people of England, but the monarchy and related institutions of the City of London. And these have their tentacles in the European Union now, very significantly in the United States, as we see from the whole Russiagate, the role of Christopher Steele, Sir Richard Dearloffe, the chaos in the last decades, the Iraq War, the Middle East escapades, and so on. Much of this has its origins from British intelligence, but the British don't have the military to back it up. And so they've tended to use, to some extent, the French, but also the United States. There's an old saying, British brains and American brawn. And that's something that Lynn has always emphasized. And he was attacked for it. You know, people said, why does LaRouche think the Queen has so much power? And he said, study it and you'll see. So I worked with LaRouche for many, many years. Starting in 1999, I was one of his two national spokesmen, and I continued until his death last February. And I think your viewers will get a sense from hearing from me the scope of our involvement and LaRouche's personal role in terms of shaping policies in the United States. And just one final point on LaRouche. I got to know during this last campaign in 2016, Roger Stone, who was a longtime friend of Donald Trump and an architect of his campaign. And when Mr. LaRouche passed away, Roger Stone was asked about that. And he said, I'm very familiar with the prophetic wisdom of Lyndon LaRouche. And he said, LaRouche played an important backstage role in the election of Donald Trump. And that doesn't mean that LaRouche talked to Donald Trump or that we're directly involved. But what Roger was referring to is this idea that there's an American system, a political system, an economic system, that's a dynamic system that allowed for the United States to become the world's greatest economic power. And then there's the British system, which is a parasitical empire, and that there's been a fight between the two. And to some extent, Donald Trump not only understands that, but has been orienting his policy towards working together with the ascending power of China and also with Russia, and shifting away from the old U.S., Europe more broadly, but specifically U.S.-British relationship. And that's what has been the central feature of my concern. I personally am somewhat of quite knowledgeable on geopolitics and how the British, going back to, you know, however far you want to go back, but especially in the beginning of the 20th century, Halford Mackinder and the theory of geopolitics, how much that shapes events in the current world. And I think that's why we've been effective in defending the president, not on his character or on all of his policies, but on his willingness to stand up and fight against this secret government that has done so much damage since the time of the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Okay, because if I look at the some of the work that were provided in Executive Intelligence Review, they explain that during the Second World War, the British services and the American service were mixed up inside the United States of America, and then after the World War, they don't completely split, but they privatize themselves, but the English stayed in the United States of America, and that's the way they influence the foreign politics of United States of America from within United States of America. Can you develop a little this aspect?
Sure. The fight in the first part of the 20th century was between the British, who wanted the United States to join them as a naval power, and those people in the United States who were more concerned with developing the United States. And this came to a head with the Franklin Roosevelt election, and people don't understand Roosevelt very well. The most interesting thing about Roosevelt was his opposition to Churchill. And Roosevelt had many, many meetings with Churchill where he said to him, look, Winston, after the war, we're not going to be rebuilding the British Empire. And this was the fighting issue between Churchill and Roosevelt. And Roosevelt had his allies like Bill Donovan, who formed the OSS, which became the basis of the CIA. But there were many people in the CIA, particularly those associated with the Harriman interests and the Dulles family, who were Anglophiles. They saw the United States as needing a partnership with Britain. They admired the British monarchy. They admired the British intelligence services. Sir William Stevenson, who was one of the key people in the SOE, the British Secret Special Operations Executive, Stevenson came over after Roosevelt's death and organized the CIA. And he also did it through the Office of Naval Intelligence. So there's always been an element of the U.S. intelligence community since World War II that oriented toward the British and the so-called special relationship. And on the other side, you had what you might call the American nationalists, who were involved internationally where they had to be, but didn't think that it was America's role to be a policeman of the world. And that tradition comes from George Washington, who warned of foreign entanglements, and from those in the United States who said, if we develop our own nation, we can be a model for others, but we don't have to impose our model physically. Now, today we have the biggest expression of the British system in the United States is the neoconservatives and the neoliberals. And these are networks that operate inside foundations such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberger Group, and others. But more importantly, inside the State Department, inside the CIA, and inside the National Security Agency. And these are the networks that were involved, I would argue, in the Kennedy assassination and the cover-up, in all the wars the United States has been involved in since then, going back to Bush Sr. and the original Iraq War. And this is also the network which is insisting that Trump is making a mistake by trying to work with Putin. Because as James Clapper, the lying former director of national intelligence, said, the Russians are genetically incapable of democracy, and they're genetically enemies of America. Now, this is the British element within the U.S. intelligence community. And I might add, in the media as well. The U.S. media is very much like the Daily Telegraph, the Economist, which is the old Rothschild publication, and so on.
So you're basically explaining to the audience that the old colonialism of the English Empire through the United States of America is pushing further and more far by the insiders that are linked to the old English heritage. They push America in the wrong direction to extend the legacy of the old British Empire, the traditional colonialism of English.
No, that's absolutely right. And you see it economically with the United States, Treasury officials and others, the total supporters of the International Monetary Fund, which functions as a kind of coordinating center for a global bankers dictatorship. You see it in the role today of people like Mark Carney, the chairman of the Bank of England, who's at the center of trying to organize a new financial system with a weaker dollar and a weak U.S. But yeah, this has been the conflict. And you see it also in the debate over such things as what should we do with Ukraine? What should we do with Syria? And, you know, as you and I were talking about before, you can see very clearly that the U.S. and the British, and by U.S. now I'm talking about the intelligence community, the State Department, worked together with the British on regime change in Libya. And of course, the French played a role in that. Syria, Ukraine, and so on. And what's interesting to me, and it's worth noting, is that in the US military, particularly in the Army, you have people who are allied with Trump's view, people who have seen war, who don't want to be in wars. They're not paperclip generals or chicken hawks like the Dick Cheney types, but they were in Iraq and they don't want war. They want the US to pull out of these wars. And who's supporting the wars? Virtually every single person in the Democratic and Republican Party, because they're steeped in this British geopolitics, the idea that you have to have an enemy image. And this goes back, and I think it's important that Trump has used this term recently, it goes back to Eisenhower's discussion of the military-industrial complex, which is not just the military or the defense contractors, but the consultants and the so-called democracy builders and the think tanks and the economists who believe in this idea today of American unilateralism. This is the American version of the British Empire, the Project for a New American Century, so-called PNAC, that came at the end of the communist era, came along and said, this is the end of history. American liberal democracy has prevailed. This is the only system that will be allowed anymore, and anyone who goes against it will pay the price. And look at Gaddafi. Look at Saddam Hussein. Look at what they tried to do to Assad. Look at the vicious attacks on Putin, and now as well in the United States on President Xi of China, because they don't go along with the International Monetary Fund and the City of London, Wall Street global policy.
I get the point, but once you talk about the English influence behind, there is obviously you cannot miss the Israelis'
of course not.
interest, because the Rothschild took the economy since this Napoleon defeat, where he took the economy of the English. Since this time, there is a really close movement between the English economy and the Jewish pro-Israeli economy. So behind what you are denouncing with the British, we cannot avoid the role of the Israeli interests that are pushing in this direction, because obviously it is their interest to do such.
Well, some people have the mistaken view that it's the Israelis that are the controllers in this, but you have to just go back to 1900 and look at the emergence around Lloyd George of what was called the British Israelites. These were not Jewish people. These were people who wanted to use the so-called Holy Land to make sure there would never be a bridge between Asia, Europe, and Africa. That's what geopolitics is about. The idea of land bridges, whether it's the Trans-Siberian Railroad or Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, that threatened British control of the seas. And so what they did from 1900 to 1916 was prepare for the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things they did was they came up with this artificial idea called Zionism, the idea that Jews want to return to the Holy Land. Now, I come from an Eastern European Jewish background. My grandparents didn't want to go to Jerusalem or Israel. They came to Brooklyn, New York. And a large number of Jews migrated from the terrible conditions in Russia and Poland with pogroms and so on to the United States. Or as Larouche once put it in a very interesting way, if a Jewish tailor in Minsk wanted to get sand up his butt, he'd go to Miami Beach instead of Tel Aviv. Now, the Balfour Declaration was the British sanctioning of creating a so-called Jewish homeland. But it wasn't possible until they rounded up the refugees from the end of World War II and shipped them to Israel and made this a cause internationally. Now, I would argue that in many cases, the Israelis have served as among the more important allies of this British Empire. And there was always a fight. Look, to go back to Eisenhower and this idea of the military-industrial complex, in 1956, the Israelis, in coordination with France and Britain, invaded Suez. They were going to knock out Nasser. And Eisenhower told the British, get the hell out, or we're going to put sanctions on you. Because he did not want a war, a confrontation between East and West over in support of Israel. It was at that point that the Israelis escalated their efforts to get nuclear technology from the French. And I would argue that the French have played a pretty dirty role as sidekicks in this Anglo-American empire. But that you're absolutely right in describing it as a new form of colonialism, where you use banker policy, conditionality policies of the International Monetary Fund, and then false flags in the form of terrorism, many of which were trained and created initially by the British and then by the CIA. So we're dealing with the legacy of a couple hundred years of British imperial policy. And unfortunately, with very few exceptions, this is what's taught as history in the United States. This is what's taught in economic policy, strategic policy. I mean, I just did a talk at a major conference on the difference between John Locke and the American Founding Fathers. The American Founding Fathers rejected Locke, and yet today you'll find everyone praising John Locke as the father of the Constitution. So there's been a brainwashing operation run by the City of London, top down through the universities, and I see the same thing in France.
We had a previous discussion through mail exchange before the interview a few days ago, and you told me that you believe that with the impeachment threat and the hysteria for most of the part coming from the Democrat part and the anti-Russian rhetoric from this side, you think that Trump is facing with this the direct legacy of what Kennedy in his time previously was confronted of.
Well, it's interesting because there are two precedents for Trump. One is John Kennedy. And Kennedy, of course, was heavily influenced by Eisenhower, who he met with Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur, the two leading World War II generals, to discuss what should be done in Vietnam. And while we don't know for sure what Kennedy would have done, he was moving away, even in the 50s, from supporting colonialism. If you read some of Kennedy's speeches as a senator in the late 50s, he was attacking British colonialism in Africa. He was speaking in favor of people like Nkrumah of Ghana and even Lumumba. He was looking at the era of a freedom of Africa for the African people, the idea of sovereignty, self-sovereignty. And Kennedy took that seriously, not just in terms of colonial wars like Vietnam, but also in terms of his commitment to freeing the United States from the tyranny of the private central bank, the Federal Reserve. In June 1963, he ordered the issuing of treasury notes because the Federal Reserve wouldn't fund economic development in the United States. So Kennedy was facing these same networks that ran the Bay of Pigs, that nearly got the world blown up in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what Kennedy did was he used back-channel discussion with Khrushchev, where he was starting to talk about how we have many things in common and we should act on that. So between his refusal to go along with British colonial plans, which was a legacy of Franklin Roosevelt, and then his moves outside of the traditional financing, and then his opposition to the CIA, I think he sealed his death warrant with that. Now, interestingly, there was a little bit of that in Ronald Reagan, and this is something that's not understood by people outside a small group of people. Reagan brought Lyndon LaRouche in 1982 to negotiate with the Soviet Union on the Strategic Defense Initiative. LaRouche was actually working with the National Security Council to meet with Russian generals and scientific figures to discuss the feasibility of joint deployment of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the anti-missile defense system, so that we could end the era of mutual and assured destruction. And this was something Reagan profoundly believed in. He talked about peace through strength, but his emphasis was on peace. And remember, Reagan was shot very early in his term. And then later in his term, he began, I think George Herbert Walker Bush began seizing all the institutions of influence in intelligence and military. And so Reagan never fulfilled that potential. And then, of course, Andropov rejected the Strategic Defense Initiative offer.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is really surprising, because in the same time you're saying that Ronald Reagan, who was staging the Star Wars program, was also trying to find an issue to the Cold War?
Trying to find an end to it.
Yeah, an issue.
Yeah.
Issue. Sorry,
Yeah.
might be another
no, but
word.
that's crucial, because any true patriot in America realizes that the last 60 years we've spent tens of trillions of dollars developing weapon systems that we've never used, that we hopefully will never use. How much of that should have gone into education? How much should have gone into healthcare, into infrastructure? And this was a point Trump made in his campaign. You know, I watched very closely how Trump destroyed the Republican Party in 2016. And he went after Jeb Bush as the Bush machine.
Yeah, completely dismantling, right.
And by destroying Jeb Bush, he destroyed all the other Republicans because they were all Bushies of one sort or another. And then he turned on Hillary with exactly the same thing, because the Clintons and the Bushes, when it comes to strategic policy, were in total lockstep. Maybe Bill was a little bit different, but Hillary was a complete supporter of what Bush and Cheney were trying to do. So Trump comes from a tradition that goes back to the idea that we should not have nuclear weapons. I'll tell you something that I'm sure most of your viewers don't know. Trump's uncle was a scientist, a very prominent physicist, who helped develop radar in the United States. And as a child, Trump used to sit with him while he talked about the fact that nuclear weapons must never, ever be used. And if you think about what was the most important meeting Trump had with Putin, what did they discuss in Helsinki? Well, all the media focused on Trump making a joke of telling Putin, don't interfere in our elections anymore, which, you know, I think Trump knows that Putin didn't do that. But what was the main discussion? We must not have a new arms race. That's what they talked about. That's why Trump keeps saying he wants to be friends with Russia, friends with China, do business with them. Let other countries be sovereign also. You know, he's ridiculed as an American firster, but he said at the United Nations General Assembly last September what he means by that. Every nation should be sovereign. Even, look what he did to make this deal with Erdogan and Putin on Syria. He said Syria should control its own territory. Now, he's still dealing with people in the intelligence community that want to keep American troops there forever. And that's the fight. And that's why there's so much opposition to Trump, because he's breaking with the paradigm, the post-Cold War paradigm of the Project for the New American Century, American unilateralism, the Bush, the Clinton, the political consensus in Washington. He's breaking with it, and they're trying to bring him down because of that.
It's my own version, but I always believe that the anti-communism rhetoric of the 60s has been completely oriented in the nowadays anti-Russian rhetoric. This is the continuation. But as you see, in the 60s, it was the extreme right wing, and now it's the leftist, basically the Democrat and the people from the other side. How can it be that the American different governments pass from extreme right to the other side and have the same rhetoric, anti-communism and then anti-Russia?
Well, Boris, look, this is such hypocrisy. I look at my own political development during the 60s, where as a Democrat, I was very much opposed to the McCarthyite tendencies, the anti-communist excuse for war, but also opposition to the intelligence community, especially the FBI. We knew the FBI were a bunch of racists who were creating channels for the Ku Klux Klan. This is all well known, targeting black elected officials.
Yeah, you're talking about Edgar Hoover, especially with his behavior with Martin Luther King or...
Exactly. But that continued. I mean, Comey himself, the person who Trump fired, in January 2017 went to Trump Tower to tell Trump he had damaging evidence that Trump was cavorting with prostitutes in Moscow. And Trump told him it's not true and you should believe me. And Comey said on leaving the meeting, he considered that his J. Edgar Hoover moment. These guys haven't changed. What's changed is the Democrats have become an immoral gang of swine who live on the tit of Wall Street. And without Wall Street, there would never have been a Clinton machine or an Al Gore machine or an Adam Schiff, because the Democrats go back to the 70s and the Frank Church Committee, which exposed the CIA for its illegal assassination units and things of that sort, and the FBI for its corruption. Today, those Democrats are wrapping themselves around Brennan, who's a killer, Clapper, who's a liar, the whole network, making Vindman the latest hero from Ukraine.
But obviously, at your age, when you look at the what we see in the media every day, don't you think it's just insanity, and this is immature stuff that are always staging on the screen? Because if you look at the behavior of the Democrat with the Ukraine gate, and they're blaming Trump for the Biden's problem. I mean,
it's worse, Boris. It's worse than that. Trump is trying to work with Zelensky to solve the problem in eastern Ukraine with Putin. And Zelensky and Putin are talking. And the Democrats, by what they're doing, are weakening Zelensky in favor of the neo-Nazis and the militia units in Ukraine. So, when I look at it, it is hard to believe, but I look at it from the standpoint of Orwell's 1984. What was the issue there? Rewriting history, changing history. So now Putin, who initially was seen as someone who was fighting to defend Russia from the predators that were brought in by Yeltsin in the post-communist era, Putin is now the gangster, the high-level KGB operative. I mean, he wasn't that high level. He was stationed in Dresden in a minor office while he was with the KGB. But what Putin represents is exactly what Trump sees, the need for leaders who fight for their people. And what Trump said is, look, where we have common interests, we can talk. Where we disagree, we can talk. But what Hillary Clinton was prepared to do, and what Obama did, is to launch criminal activity in Syria. One of the key people, actually, there are two people who Trump had appointed who were targeted because of what they knew. And this actually reflects back on what happened in the Kennedy era. But you had Paul Manafort, who understood the situation in Ukraine. And they framed him up with a phony issue of a black ledger that claimed he was getting all this illegal money. And this is part of the Ukraine Gate story. The other one was Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. When he was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he compiled a report of CIA and other operatives of the US government smuggling arms to the jihadists in Syria. And for that, he was fired by Obama. So when he came to Trump, this was their worst nightmare. They were going to have Manafort, who understood the role of Biden and others in destroying Ukraine, and they would have had Flynn, who knew the role of the United States in supporting the terrorists. So what do? They get Mueller to target Flynn and Manafort, frame them up, FBI sting operations, working together with the British, the Ukrainians, the Australians, and the Italians, and get them out. And then they figured they could beat down Trump and get him to submit. They actually figured that Trump wouldn't win the election in the first place. So we're dealing with these criminal enterprises inside the intelligence community that have this inherent belief that we must have conflict in the world. This is why I bring up Orwell. And as you pointed out, Kennedy was prepared to break with that, and he paid a price.
But obviously, when you look at what took place in Bolivia with Evo Morales recently, will you say that because you can see in South America with the death of Hugo Chavez and what happened to Evo Morales, this is the direct behavior of the old CIA operation, like Allen Dulles did in his time, and Kennedy tried to replace this. Will you say that Trump is clear concerning this foreign policy, or will you say that Trump is not so clear with the continuation of this? Because sometimes it seems that Trump is playing a strange game. He seems to applaud some of the events, that took place, and which is a bit contradictory from his promises. He has been elected. He promises not to overthrow other regime over the world and to focus on his own economy. But when you see the coup d'etat that took place in South America, it seems that nothing has changed, in fact.
Well, without meaning this as an apology for Trump, I want to point out that he doesn't have his own people in place. We see that in terms of this parade of diplomats from the Ukraine hearings. William Taylor, George Kent, Fiona Hill. These are anti-Trump people who are still in positions of power. Now, here's what I would argue. Because of Russiagate, he's been on the defensive since the day he entered office. And anytime he shows any moves toward going against what he called the swamp, he's hit with another scandal. Now, on the other hand, I'm sure he doesn't really understand fully what's going on in Latin America. It's not his area of interest. But at the same time, you have the Morales coup in Bolivia. You have other, Bolsonaro in Brazil. You just had an election in Argentina that threw out the Wall Street puppet Macri. You have millions of people in the streets of Chile, finally about to overturn the legacy of Pinochet, which was an American CIA coup. You have Trump working with Lopez Obrador. No one thought that would happen. Lopez Obrador is known as a leftist, a socialist, whatever. He and Trump have a complicated but decent relationship, where Trump can see, one other example is with China, where you have crazies like Marco Rubio from Florida, who's the legacy of the old gusanos of the Cuban movement, who are calling for literally a war with China. Trump they insisted, you have to say something about Hong Kong. And he said, look, we want democracy in Hong Kong, but I leave that to my good friend Xi Jinping, who I trust and admire. So Trump is trying to navigate an extremely small channel with a very small group of people, many of whom are not that competent, like this guy Sondland, who became his ambassador to the European Union. But I think on the important issues, the life and death issues for the planet, which include U.S.-Russia relations, U.S.-China relations, Trump has done the right thing. In the Middle East, he's done the right thing. You know, what do I think he's right in defending Israel to the extent he has? No, but I think he's got a different plan there. And in fact, I think Trump's view is farm some of this out to Putin. Let Putin deal with it, because Putin also has good relations with Israel and with Saudi Arabia. So I think they're trying to carry out a change from the neoconservative unilateralist paradigm to a new paradigm. And it's going to take a while, but that's why I'm devoting almost all of my activity, and Larouche PAC is devoting its activity to stopping this coup, but stopping it by showing that the people who are running the coup are the same people who ran the wars, run the torture and terror operations, and also run the International Monetary Fund austerity policies that are destroying nations. And if Trump were to be more open and clear on that, I think he would be able to drain the swamp and clean things up. And why he's not, I can't really tell you.
But this is something I want to develop in this interview, because when we look back at the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, it seems that the Commonwealth developed many networks all over the planet to extend the interest of some elite circles. And basically, they used a private company to hide criminal organization, and they had a lot of assassins. I have a personal story to tell you, but because maybe you don't know this, but it's a personal experience. Have you ever heard about the crash that took place in Mont Blanc in 1966? The Air India 101 flight. Have you ever heard about this?
No.
Okay. There was 106 persons that died there, no survivor. Though I believe there was one American citizen in it from Oregon. At the period, they blamed the pilot D'Souza for the crash, but he was a very experienced pilot, in fact. So I'm born at the feet of the Mont Blanc, where it took place. I'm born there. I have a friend who went into the mountain and find pieces of the plane, and he showed me pictures. There was not only the civilian plane there, but also a military aircraft from Italian and NATO on the same area. And on the some pieces there were inscribed U.S. Air Force in it. And he showed me some evidence of an explosion of the civilian plane fuselage. Many people believe it wasn't a crash accident, but an international destruction from NATO, because in the plane was the father of the nuclear program of India. I don't pronounce his name because it's very difficult to speak in India. And he was going to Switzerland to make a peace speech publicly about the program. He wanted to use the program, the nuclear program, for peace, not for military. And the Prime Minister of India died few months before in strange circumstances. I see in this kind of tragedy the end of those networks of the Commonwealth who were at this time assassinated. People like Enrico Mattei, they tried with de Gaulle. They were assassinating all the people who were against their interests. So I believe, if we talk about this, that those networks has increased since this period in the world, and it's very difficult to stop this process, in fact. What is your vision about the fact that this Octopussy is a very huge monster, unseen huge monsters?
Well, you're absolutely right, and you're talking about things that are extremely important. The assassination with Enrico Mattei is at the center of this, the Italian head of the ENI oil company, who is very much opposed to the idea of East-West confrontation. I'll give you some other examples. When the Berlin Wall came down, the head of Deutsche Bank at the time was a man named Alfred Herrhausen. And Herrhausen was saying we should not use shock therapy against Russia and Eastern Europe. We should help them build up their industries. They have a skilled workforce. They just had a crappy system. Let's help them modernize it so we can integrate them into the Western system. Herrhausen was assassinated by a non-existent terror unit called the Third Generation Baader-Meinhof. About 3 months later, or 4 months later, Rohwedder, who was in charge of the Treuhand, which is the trust that was supposed to do the transition from communism to a Western economy, Rohwedder was opposed to a total free market shift. He wanted to have a way of propping up and improving the conditions in the East. He was a second target of this non-existent terror operation. In Europe, this goes back to the late 50s and early 60s, something called Operation Gladio. And this is a crucial operation because through NATO, and it goes back before that to the Italian operations, the operations in France against the resistance movement, the French Communist Party, and so on. But there were assassinations, there were dirty tricks, there were all kinds of operations run to destroy anyone who argued that Europe should have an independent policy course. And one of the key people who was targeted was Charles de Gaulle, because de Gaulle was someone who had a different vision for Europe. His idea of Europe, he's probably turning over in his grave over the European Union. He wanted a union in Europe, but he wanted a sovereign nation states allied from the Atlantic to the Urals. He saw Russia as part of Europe. And instead, you had the geopolitical confrontation between East and West. And so, I don't know, there were a dozen assassination attempts against de Gaulle, many of them run by the CIA probably out of their Rome office, with networks that incorporated French fascists and the remnants of the old Nazi regime that was rescued by Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA until Kennedy fired him after the Bay of Pigs. Now, if you look at Allen Dulles' role in this, you begin to get at the unelected control networks that were a part of American intelligence, British intelligence, and co-opted people from France, Italy, and Germany. And that's why, Germany's a mess today, because its leadership still thinks as an occupied country. And I think that the legacy of de Gaulle has been so smeared and attacked that people, you get someone like Sarkozy, who would occasionally pretend he was a Gaullist, or Jacques Chirac, who was a poor imitation of de Gaulle. There are very few Gaullists left, but this was the target of this British operation. And the British brought the Americans in, and people like James Jesus Angleton, who was the sidekick of Allen Dulles, who ran counterintelligence for the CIA for years. These are the people who most likely were involved in the Kennedy assassination. And what's their legacy today? John Brennan, James Clapper, Susan Rice. You had Fiona Hill testifying against Trump. She's supposedly the top Russia expert. Who was her mentor? It was Pipes and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Brzezinski comes from the same crowd, of these globalists who believe that sovereignty is a threat to a global system of financial elites. Well, look at what's coming out now from the chemical warfare investigation in Syria, the fact that this was a fraud. The Skripal case in London, another fraud. The idea that the Russians shot down the jetliner over Ukraine. There are so many of these frauds. Just last month, there was an assassination of the chief engineer of the modern dam that was just built in Ethiopia. So, people who represent this tradition, and you mentioned India, look at the Gandhi family, what was done to Indira Gandhi and then Rajiv Gandhi. And that's the British playground. You look at the Saudi role, the Wahhabite, that was developed at Oxford, that artificial synthetic version of Islam. Look at the synthetic version of Judaism that presides in Israel now, Zionism. That's another product of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford.
If you look at the transformation of those networks with time, they adapt themselves with the historical process. They were anti-communism at the period of Kennedy, but once USSR failed, they transformed into a group that financed the failed jihadists to destroy, stage this war on terrorism, financing terrorism to justify their interventionism.
No, you're absolutely right. And look, they had to evolve to some extent, because after communism fell, what was the purpose of NATO? Well, all of a sudden, the purpose of NATO is to protect the Ukrainian people, except the people who were doing that destroyed Ukraine. If you look at Ukraine in 1991, it had the 10th largest GDP per capita in the world. Today, Ukraine is 42nd out of 42nd European countries in per capita GDP. Why? The International Monetary Fund and then the Maidan coup in February 2014. The people who were out there complaining that Trump is threatening to bully Ukraine and attack Ukraine and blackmail Ukraine, they're the ones who destroyed Ukraine. Now, did the media report any of it? No, not at all.
Oh, you're completely right on this. If I look at the coup d'etat that took place in Ukraine recently, on our modern era, the media version is completely insane, because I know, because I studied it, that the CIA came with a large amount of money.
$5 billion is what Victoria Nuland admitted, the Undersecretary of State who was there.
It was the period of Obama, Ashton, Clinton, Biden, all of with among Soros.
And don't forget George Soros.
Yeah,
George Soros was involved in that. You have a permanent regime change operation, color revolution. They're now operating in Hong Kong to try and overthrow. They're not going to overthrow China, but to cause disruptions there. But here's the point: why do they do these things? They have a system which is collapsing. The Western financial system is extremely weak right now. Never recovered from 2008, and in fact, it continued the same policies after 2008. And instead of recognizing they're flawed, this idea of a free market speculative economy is flawed, they're going double down with it. Now, here's the problem they have. You have rebellion all over the world. You had Brexit. You had the Trump election. You have in Germany, the CDU and the SPD are collapsing as parties. In Italy, ultimately, I think Salvini and the Lega is going to get back into power. You know, France is a little bit different, but I think the shine of Macron is gone, and he's being exposed as nothing but a puppet for these same criminal bankers. But then you look, as I mentioned, Chile, Brazil, Argentina. There's a global rebellion against this consensus.
Because it's obvious, you can see their behavior, that it's insane. It's immature. If you look at the accusation of Biden against Trump, obviously everybody heard what he said on TV concerning the Ukraine gate and his son blackmailing the Ukraine justice. How can people believe those guys? They are completely crazy.
But that's the point. I don't know if you've seen the polls in the U.S. since the 2 weeks of impeachment hearings, but the support for impeachment has dropped. And the Democrats are terrified because they say they can't beat Trump in 2020. Now,
they won't.
Here's the problem. The reason there's this rebellion is that people can no longer make ends meet. I heard one of the yellow vest people was asked on an interview on the street, they said, aren't you worried about climate change and that's going to destroy the planet? And he said, you're talking about something in 50 years. I'm trying to make it through the end of the month, which I can't do with these new taxes. Now, people are being hurt by the policies, badly hurt. The suicide rates are up in places like Greece, in places like Ohio and West Virginia and Wisconsin in the United States. The opioid epidemic is killing close to 100,000 Americans, young people who have lost hope. So people are angry about it. They're frustrated. So they know what they don't want. They didn't want Hillary Clinton, but they don't know what they need. And what we do at Larouche PAC is we present economic alternatives. And let me just throw this out now, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time. But if you look at what China is doing with the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're going into countries and they're saying, we'll loan you the money, we'll provide some of the expertise and help you build high-speed rail, build modern power plants, build dams, build connections between your cities in Africa. The Africans are finally saying this is what they want. And what do the Europeans say? They say this is a debt trap. China's trying to get these countries in debt. The debt trap is what the IMF and the British colonial system was. The Chinese are working with countries to establish a potential for growth. The difference between what the Chinese are doing and what the British did is the same difference between what the Americans did at the founding of our country and the British. In the United States, we created credit to build something new that would increase the total value of production. Value added, it's called. What the British do is create debt. They loan money to create debt, and then they make you sign agreements to pay off the debt. And if you don't do it, they kill you.
But you believe in the methodology of China's? Yes. You believe in this? Because I have information on the ground that they have dirty behavior with the workers, and the condition of work are really dirty with the Chinese. It's not.
Look, we have people who travel to China all the time, and I'll tell you, the Chinese, according to the figures of the World Bank, have lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Do they have Western standard of living yet? Not yet. But the situation inside China is very different, and the people targeting China are the same people who are running these imperial policies because they don't want Xi Jinping to succeed. And I would urge you, we just put out a pamphlet on the anti-China hysteria in the United States. I'll send you a link because I think you should read it. I'm not saying everything that's done in China is proper, but if you compare what the Chinese are doing with what's being done and has been done in the Middle East by the British, the US, and the French, the Chinese are setting up education centers. They've invited Western journalists to tour Sichuan province, the so-called Uyghur concentration camps, and the journalists won't go. They say it's a Potemkin village. But the Chinese are not shutting down mosques. They're not threatening Muslims the way that's happened in Western countries. So I think you should look at this China question from the standpoint of why it is that the British and their allies want to stop the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
I understand your point of view, but I perceive the Chinese as a subversion of what we are criticizing. I'm not that confident in the.
Well, I'll send you our report. You can take a look at it.
Okay.
Because a lot of what we hear from China is coming from the Falun Gong, which is a real cult, which is financed heavily by the same networks we're talking about, the Soros networks and others. We're seeing a collapse in the West. People are rebelling against it. Look, in the United States, what did Trump say in the campaign? He said, we're spending trillions of dollars. We've added $7 trillion to our debt to fight a war that we created. That was none of our business. It's led to thousands of deaths of young Americans. It's led to hundreds of thousands of lives of Americans ruined. We've killed millions of people in these countries. We've turned people in those countries against the West.
But Europe did the same. Europe did the same. Among America, you have the Europeans that were under the influence of United States of America. So we are under the same debt.
Exactly.
And
for what? What did we gain from it? Did we improve the conditions in any of those countries? You know, people who talk about Assad as a brutal dictator and killing all these people, causing all these refugees. You know, before the civil war started in Syria, no one was leaving Syria. Syria was calm. Same thing with Baghdad. You know, these are tough places to rule. But in Baghdad, you had women in positions of influence. You had Christians in the government. Tariq Aziz was the vice president.
Libya was the highest economy of Africa before we completely ruined it. You're right.
And you look at what Gaddafi was doing in Libya with water projects and free education.
Absolutely.
And what did we do to bring so-called Western democracy? We destroyed all of that. So the hypocrisy is unbelievable. But I think what's useful is to go back and look at who's doing it and why. And it's not just about money for the military. It's about global governance. It's about the idea of a top-down banker's dictatorship in which no country has the right to get out of line. And beyond that, the push to ensure that there's a reduction of world population, which is being pushed by the same bankers, people like Mark Carney of the Bank of England, who's now saying that banks won't loan any money to any company that's going to produce energy unless it's solar and wind. They're destroying the global economy. You know, the Africans, what do the Africans want? They want electricity. They know they're not going to get electricity to modernize from wind and solar. So we're seeing policies that are being implemented that go back to the period at the end of World War II that basically started with the idea that an Anglo-American governance has to control things. Now, as I was saying earlier, this is something Franklin Roosevelt was fighting against. And the initial idea of the Bretton Woods system of Roosevelt was that with fixed exchange rates based on a relationship to gold, you would not allow for currency speculation. And once Nixon got rid of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, you opened the door for the Soroses and others. And as a result, we've seen deregulation, privatization, the incredible inequality of wealth. And that's what's defended by these war hawks. They're defending a system that's anti-human.
I understand your point of view, but I have to make a statement that Roosevelt, except the fact that you said he has some difference with Churchill, he was also pushing for a war that wasn't necessary for the world. He was behind the people that were pushing for the war, the Second World War, and made a lot of publicity for it, while a lot of people were against the war. So I agree.
I don't know when you're talking about. Look, Roosevelt, I think World War II was a necessary fight once it happened. The people who were the criminals in World War II are people like the Bush networks and the Harriman networks who funded the Nazis, working together with Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England. The British wanted Hitler in power because they wanted Germany fighting Russia. And they wanted to make sure that France and Russia never allied with Germany. That's why World War I happened.
Yeah, but you also have financial interests that were pushing behind Churchill and Roosevelt to have this war because there was interest. And the problem with Roosevelt, he wasn't clear concerning the fact that he pushed for this war. Well, it wasn't.
Well, I think you have to. I can send you some material on that. Let me tell you something interesting. In 1942, a bank called the Union Bank Corporation of New York was seized by the Attorney General under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The two leading members of this bank were Roland Harriman, the brother of Averell Harriman, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, and Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush. This bank was providing millions of dollars to the Nazi war machine, even after the United States was at war with Germany. So there were Americans who played a role in putting the Nazis in power, and they wanted them in power. But Roosevelt was not one of them. And I think Roosevelt was right to bring the United States into the war for the same reason de Gaulle was right for trying to rally the French people against the Vichy regime.
Okay, so you're sure about this, about Roosevelt, yeah. Your version, you're sure about this.
Now, yeah, I'm sure about it. I mean, Roosevelt's economic policies came from Alexander Hamilton, who was the founding father, who was opposed to the idea of private central banks and instead wanted government banks so there would be credit available for investment in physical production. So this is a longer discussion.
Okay, no. But the interest of the interview is to have the point of view of specialists on those topics. I want to develop the methodology of the Ukraine Gate to expose the similarity with the way they killed Kennedy.
Sure, that's exactly what I just did that, in fact, on a radio show in Washington, D.C. a couple of days ago. No, I think it's really important because it gets us at this question. It makes real what we mean by the shadow government.
We see the same methodology that is more and more sophisticated with time, in fact.
And it's not a conspiracy theory.